Hello, this is Japanese Economic Review Channel. Today, we are getting right into the official preliminary trade stats for Japan for 2025. And let me tell you, the headline number looks fantastic. But once you peel back a layer or two, you find a really surprising story about what's actually going on.
So let's start with the big one, the number everyone's talking about, a trade deficit of 2.65 trillion yen. Now that's a deficit, and it's actually the fifth year in a row we've seen one. But, and this is a big but, that number doesn't tell you the whole story, not even close.
And while a deficit never sounds great, you have to look at the context here. That 2.65 trillion yen, it's less than half of what the deficit was just last year. I mean, that is a huge improvement, a 52.9% drop. So the real question is, what on earth happened? What's driving this massive shift?
All right, to figure this out, we need to look at something that's a bit of a classic puzzle in economics. It's this idea of value versus volume. Basically, it's not just about the price tag of what you sell, it's also about how many actual things you're shipping out the door. So if you just look at the money side of things, it seems pretty simple, right? The total value of Japan's exports went up by 3.1%. At the same time, the value of imports only nudged up by 0.3%. I mean, that's simple math. If you're making more money and not spending much more, your deficit is going to shrink. Case closed. Or is it? But, and this is where it gets really fascinating, does a higher price tag actually mean Japan is selling more goods? You'd think so, wouldn't you? Well, the data tells a very different story. Okay, check this out. When you look at the actual quantity of stuff, the physical volume, Japan actually exported a little bit less than it did the year before. And at the same time, it imported more. So wait a minute, how's that possible? How does the deficit get smaller if you're selling fewer items and buying more? The answer is all about price. Japan wasn't selling more, it was selling more valuable things. The price of its exports went up enough to completely outweigh the fact that the volume went down. So that's the big picture of what's happening. Now let's talk about the where. Because this isn't a single global story. Oh no. It's more like a collection of completely different stories depending on which country we're looking at. Japan's trade situation is really a tale of its key partners. And this chart just lays it all out, doesn't it? On one hand, you've got these huge surpluses, a massive 7.5 trillion yen surplus with the US and another solid 4.2 trillion with the rest of Asia. But then look at the other side. A big deficit with the EU, and then, wow, an absolutely enormous 7.9 trillion yen deficit with China. It's a real tug of war. Let's break that down starting with the United States. Now, Japan still has a really big surplus with the US, no doubt about that. But what's interesting is that the surplus actually got smaller this year by more than 12%. And the main reason for that is that exports to the US, especially things like cars, dropped for the first time in 5 years. That's a pretty notable shift. Okay, now let's turn to the European Union. The story here is, well, it's consistent, but not in a good way for Japan. The deficit with the EU is not just there, it's getting bigger. It widened by a whopping 32% this year. And believe it or not, this is the 14th year in a row that Japan has had a trade deficit with the EU. That's not a blip, that's a well-established pattern. All right, how about Asia? As a whole region, it looks fantastic for Japan. The surplus grew by over 40%. That's a huge bright spot. But that big, happy number for Asia is hiding something really important. You have to pull out the single biggest player in the region to see what's really going on. And of course, I'm talking about China. And when you isolate China, wow, the picture changes dramatically. The deficit with China just exploded, growing by almost 23%. In fact, it's now the biggest single reason for Japan's entire trade deficit. And the cause is crystal clear. Exports to China didn't really go anywhere, but imports from China just shot up. So with all these moving parts, it's really important to get some perspective. To really understand what this year's number means, we have to zoom out and look at the last decade, which has been, well, a real roller coaster for Japanese trade. And I mean, look at this. It has been a complete roller coaster. Back in 2016, Japan had a nice, healthy surplus. Then, fast forward to 2022, and it hits a record-shattering deficit of over 20 trillion yen. So when you see this year's 2.65 trillion deficit in that context, you realize, yes, it's a massive recovery from that all-time low, but Japan is definitely not out of the woods yet. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, it's that the headline number, that shrinking deficit, is a bit of an illusion. It looks like a great recovery, but it's built on a really complex, maybe even fragile foundation. It's a recovery that's happening because Japan is selling fewer things at a higher price. And it's all taking place in a world where Japan's trade is incredibly polarized. Huge wins with some countries are getting wiped out by huge losses with others.
And that really leaves us with the big question looking forward, doesn't it? Is this strategy sustainable? Can Japan keep relying on selling higher value exports to make up for selling lower volumes? What happens if that trend of declining volume gets worse? I think that's really going to be the central challenge to watch in the coming years.
Thank you for watching the Japanese Economic Review. We look forward to having you with us again.